4 men, 4 voices torn apart by terror. 4 bodies broken beneath the same hooves they once commanded. History would soften it with ink and paperwork, calling it misfortune, a cruel convergence of chance and panic. Those who heard the screams called it something else entirely, and the man who unlocked the gates that night, who watched the shadows move, then vanish, carried the truth in his chest until silence swallowed him whole. He never explained what happened behind Riverside Estate. He never denied it either, and that unspoken space between confession and denial became the most unsettling echo of all. The sound itself was unforgettable, not cinematic, not grand, just the brutal percussion of flesh-meeting force, the awful damp impact of weight and momentum colliding with bone. Horses do not hesitate when fear takes them. They crush, they surge, they flee. And when they do, men become obstacles, nothing more. That night, the screaming came in waves, rising and breaking across the fields, then cutting off one by one, until only the horses remained, snorting, stamping, alive. It was late summer when it happened, a night thick with heat and unease. The air over southern Virginia felt wrong, as if it knew something the people did not. The tobacco fields surrounding Riverside Estate stretched outward like dark water, swallowing sound, swallowing witnesses. When dawn arrived, 4 masters lay dead in the dirt, and the coroner, pale and trembling, wrote word that failed to explain why seasoned horsemen had died like strangers beneath their own animals. Accidents do not choose with such precision. They do not arrive fully formed, with timing that feels deliberate. They do not leave behind a single survivor who steps into the dark and erases himself from the world. Riverside Estate still exists, polished by time and denial. The paddock is gone now, buried beneath stone and grass. But the land remembers. Families bearing those old names still walk the roads nearby, their ancestors carved into marble and granite, honored, sanitized. Ask them about the night their bloodline screamed into the soil, and they will look away. Some will claim ignorance, others will smile tightly and say nothing, because knowing would mean facing the possibility that justice does not always wear a lawful face. This is the story of Thomas Garrett, a man whose hands smelled of leather and hay, whose life was measured in dawns and dusk feedings. 15 years he tended horses he could never claim, answering to men who never learned his voice. To them he was a tool that breathed. To the animals, he was the only constant in a world of commands and cruelty. He learned their tempers, their fears, the way they shifted when threatened, the sounds that sent them into blind panic. Knowledge is quiet. It waits. Revenge waits too. Riverside Estate sprawled across rich land south of Richmond, its white columns glowing with inherited arrogance. The main house stood proud, even as the world around it cracked. Behind it, barns and stables formed a working heart that kept the illusion alive. The war had been grinding on, draining men, money, and certainty. The old order was dying, but the men at Riverside refused to see the grave opening beneath their feet. The Harrington name ruled the property, passed down through generations, built on forced labor and silence. What was once abundance had become desperation. Enslaved people vanished through sale, escape, or death. Those who remained lived suspended between endings and unknown beginnings. Fear permeated everything, sharp and constant. 4 men mattered most that night. Edmund Harrington, eldest son, carried entitlement like a second skin. He spoke of honor while hiding from battle, of tradition while bleeding the estate dry. His brother Charles followed, quieter but no less cruel, a man who enjoyed punishment for the simple proof of power. Alongside them stood their cousins and partners, men bound by money and shared belief that ownership made them untouchable. They trusted their horses because they believed everything belonged to them. They forgot who truly understood those animals. Thomas Garrett saw the cracks long before the collapse. He felt the tension in the stables, heard it in restless hooves and strained breaths. He endured insults, beatings, and erasure, storing each moment away with careful patience. He knew which gate stuck, which latch screamed when forced, which horse would bolt if startled just right. He did not need weapons. He needed timing. That night, the masters gathered to inspect damage, angry and drunk on fading authority. The horses sensed it. Animals always do. When Thomas opened the wrong gate at the right moment, fear poured into the paddock like fire. A shout, a crack of wood, then chaos. Horses surged, men fell. Screams fractured the dark. There was no single blow, no clear murderer, only momentum and panic and the terrible equality of trampling hooves. Thomas did not run. He watched until it was over. Then he walked away, leaving history to argue with itself. By morning he was gone. No trail, no body, just absence. People still whisper that what happened felt planned, that the night itself seemed complicit. But there was nothing otherworldly there, no curse, no ghost, just a man who understood the tools of his suffering better than those who wielded them. That is what makes it unbearable. That is what makes it real. Some revenge announces itself with fire and blood. This one arrived on soft hooves and waited for fear to do the rest. And even now, long after the screams faded, Riverside Estate exhales something uneasy into the night, as if the land itself remembers the moment power finally slipped and never returned. Edmund Harrington wrapped his cruelty in language that sounded almost gentle. He claimed frailty when the war called, whispering about a fragile heart that somehow never interfered with long nights of whiskey or the strength in his arm when punishment was ordered. He was a man split clean down the middle, capable of reciting poetry by candlelight, capable of discussing ethics and destiny as if they were parlor games, yet utterly convinced that other human beings existed solely to be owned. In his own twisted reasoning, mercy meant restraint. He told himself that he was kind because he reserved the lash for what he deemed serious disobedience, never questioning who had given him the right to decide what suffering was acceptable. In his mind, the food and shelter provided by Riverside Estate were gifts, proof of generosity. He never once allowed himself to consider the theft at the heart of it all. Freedom had been stripped away, names erased, futures stolen, and yet Edmund slept soundly, believing himself righteous. When his wife Margaret died, bringing life into the world only to lose it moments later, grief visited him briefly, like an unwelcome guest. 3 months of mourning, no more. After that, his attention turned outward again, to Richmond, to another woman. 2 weekly visits paid for with money the estate no longer truly had. His surviving children grew under the care of enslaved women whose grief was never acknowledged, whose love was demanded but never returned. If Edmund embodied hypocrisy, his brother Charles embodied spite. Younger, sharper in temperament, he carried bitterness like a permanent wound. A brief taste of cavalry life ended not in glory, but humiliation, a fall from the saddle that left his body crooked and his pride shattered. The limp never healed, and neither did his anger. He drank to dull it, and when the drink failed, he reached for violence. Once handsome, he had become swollen with resentment, his face flushed with excess, his eyes always searching for someone weaker to blame. Charles found pleasure in punishment, not for order, not for discipline, but for release. Every small mistake became an excuse, every hesitation a crime. The horse that had thrown him during training haunted him more than the pain in his leg, a spirited mare full of nervous energy. She had refused a jump and sent him crashing into the dirt. In that moment, she had robbed him of the heroic story he believed he deserved. He wanted her destroyed, erased. When Edmund refused, seeing value where Charles saw insult, Charles claimed her instead. He rode her mercilessly, confusing dominance with control, pain with obedience. Each strike was less about the animal beneath him, and more about a life slipping out of his hands. Marcus Whitfield watched all of this with cool, detached eyes. Where the Harrington brothers were driven by ego and emotion, Marcus moved by calculation alone. Thin, precise, always smelling faintly of ink and paper, he reduced lives to columns and totals. He married into the family not for affection but for advantage, exchanging partnership for a dowry and connection. Love was inefficient. Children were liabilities. His ledgers were immaculate, his conscience untouched. To Marcus, enslaved people were investments, horses were assets, and the estate itself was a machine that existed to generate profit. He visited often, inspecting numbers, evaluating losses, already thinking about what could be sold if the war tightened its grip. It had been his idea to bring in a skilled, stable master years earlier, not out of kindness, but foresight. Better care meant higher value. He took pride in his self-image as a rational man, one who did not lash out in anger. His punishments were measured, recorded, justified on paper. In his mind, this made him superior, civilized. He never noticed how the neatness of his records only made the suffering more efficient. And then there was Daniel Cross. Unlike the others, Daniel had clawed his way upward from nothing, and that ascent had stripped something essential from him. He remembered hunger, he remembered fear, he remembered being invisible. Those memories hardened into a vow that he would never again kneel to anyone. When power finally came, he wrapped himself in it completely. Control was not a tool to him, it was an identity. Broad-shouldered and solid, Daniel carried the weight of years of labor in his muscles. He had left home young, carrying nothing but determination and a willingness to do what others would not. He learned quickly that cruelty could be currency, that obedience could be forced, that fear was the fastest way to build order. Plantation owners noticed. Recommendations followed. By the time he arrived at Riverside, he was already known for efficiency that bordered on savagery. Daniel lived apart from everyone, as if separation reinforced authority. No family softened him. No friendships distracted him. His world was the estate, and the estate was his domain. The whip was never far from his hand. What made him truly dangerous was not just his strength, but his understanding. He studied people the way others studied animals. He learned how unpredictability kept them off balance, how silence could wound deeper than blows, how hope could be dangled and crushed at will. Together, these four men formed a system of oppression so complete that it seemed immovable. Each believed himself essential. Each believed himself untouchable. They did not see how their combined cruelty created a pressure that could only end in rupture. They did not see the quiet eyes watching from the stables, the man who learned without speaking, who absorbed every lesson their behavior taught. And as the shadows lengthened over Riverside Estate, as the horses shifted restlessly in their stalls, something unseen began to take shape. Not a ghost, not a curse, just the inevitable consequence of power abused for too long, the kind of consequence that does not announce itself with thunder but waits patiently, in the dark, breathing softly, until the moment arrives and fear is finally set free. Cruelty at Riverside was never random. It was engineered. Mercy was offered, sparingly, like a faint light at the end of a tunnel, only to be extinguished at the precise moment it became believable. Hope was planted carefully, nurtured just enough to take root, then ripped out without warning. The effect was devastating. People stopped dreaming. They stopped imagining escape. Despair became orderly, predictable, controllable. That was the point. It was not rage that ruled the estate. It was design. Every Wednesday evening, that design took human form. As dusk settled and the cicadas began their restless chorus, the four men gathered in the study of the main house. They called themselves the Riverside Council, a title soaked in self-importance, as if they were architects of destiny rather than caretakers of rot. The room smelled of polished wood, smoke, and imported brandy that had slipped through blockades at obscene cost. Oil lamps cast long shadows across shelves of books no one read anymore. They met at the same hour every week, as faithfully as a church service, as devotedly as a ritual sacrifice. Edmund poured the drinks with ceremonial care, the amber liquid catching the light like false gold. Cigars were lit, smoke curled upward, clinging to the ceiling like something alive. Marcus spoke first, always Marcus. Numbers flowed from him in a calm, lifeless stream. Losses, declines, obstacles, tobacco that could not be sold, ships that never arrived. Money bleeding away faster than it could be replaced. Each sentence was a nail in a coffin they pretended not to see. Edmund followed with optimism that sounded rehearsed even to himself. He spoke of victory that would never come, of recovery that no longer made sense. Charles interrupted with bitterness, cursing enemies both real and imagined, his voice thick with drink and resentment. Daniel spoke last, his reports quiet and efficient, filled with suggestions that tasted like iron. More control, more fear, more punishment. And they nodded, all of them, drinking deeply, congratulating themselves on their intelligence, their strength, their right to rule. They told themselves the world was not ending, but it was. They felt it in the silence that followed laughter, in the way the nights stretched longer. In the eyes of the people they no longer trusted to stay, terror lived beneath their bravado, and terror made them reckless, dangerous. In the heat of that summer, desperation soaked into the soil of Riverside Estate, thick and unseen, waiting, and while the council congratulated itself in candlelight, another man listened to the land itself. Thomas Garrett had lived on the estate longer than any of them cared to remember. He arrived young, sold not for brute strength but for skill, evaluated like equipment and priced accordingly. Horses were his language. He understood their bodies, their moods, the way fear moved through them like a storm. He lived above the stable, close enough to hear every shift of weight, every uneasy breath in the dark. He ate little, slept lightly, watched everything. He had once believed Riverside might be different. That belief had died slowly, not in one moment but in countless small erasures. Love denied, grief interrupted, dignity stripped away piece by piece. When Ruth fell ill, when fever took her breath and her voice, Thomas was not allowed to sit beside her. A saddle mattered more, a ride mattered more. That memory never faded. It sharpened. Thomas had been shaped by loss long before Riverside, a father erased by sale, a mother claimed by sickness, knowledge passed down by a man who taught him patience instead of violence, trust instead of dominance. From Benjamin he learned that animals remembered kindness. That fear was a language, but not the only one. When Benjamin died, something settled inside Thomas, not hatred, resolve. At Riverside, he cared for 17 horses, each one known to him more intimately than the men who owned them. He knew the rhythm of their steps, the patterns of their breathing, the small rituals that calmed them. He spoke to them softly, not because they understood words, but because they understood tone. They trusted him completely. Sovereign was the pride of the estate, tall and powerful, a creature bred for command. With Thomas, he lowered his head willingly, brushed against him like a companion. Tempest was different, nervous, alert. Her eyes tracked shadows, her muscles coiled with memory. Others saw her as difficult. Thomas saw a spirit strained by cruelty. When she rested her head against his chest, breathing slow and warm, it felt like an unspoken agreement. The horses knew things the men did not. They sensed the tension in the air, the way fear seeped into the nights. They responded to Thomas because he never lied to them. He never pretended. As summer pressed closer to its breaking point, the estate felt watched, not by ghosts, by consequence. The council continued to meet, continued to drink, continued to plan harsher measures. They believed control could still be tightened, that order could still be enforced. They did not notice how the horses shifted more often, how tempest as ears flicked toward sounds no one else heard, how sovereign as patience grew thin around unfamiliar voices. Thomas noticed everything. He learned the timing of the meetings, the way the estate settled into false calm, the paths people took, the locks that stuck, the gates that groaned when forced too quickly. He did not rush. Revenge, like training a horse, required patience. Pressure applied at the wrong moment only created chaos without purpose. And when the moment finally began to form, it did so quietly. No grand declaration, no vow spoken aloud. Just a man standing in a stable heavy with breath and shadow, surrounded by animals who trusted him more than any human ever had. The night air carried the scent of brandy and arrogance from the house beyond. The land held its breath, and somewhere between hoof and heartbeat, between fear and instinct, the inevitable drew closer, unseen, unstoppable, waiting for the gate to open and the dark to answer back. Trust revealed itself in small, fragile gestures, a lowered head, a slow breath against a human chest, a quiet stillness that only came when fear had finally loosened its grip. Thomas recognized those signs instantly. They were rare gifts, and he guarded them fiercely. Midnight, the dark-coated gelding owned by Marcus, embodied that quiet reliability. He was not bred for spectacle or praise, but for endurance. Thomas had guided him since he was little more than an awkward shadow on long legs, shaping patience into muscle and calm into instinct. Midnight responded to Thomas alone, following his voice as if it were an anchor in a shifting world. Then there was Brutus, young, powerful, still unsure of his own strength. The chestnut stallion tested limits, because that was his nature. He was learning who he was meant to become. Thomas approached him with care, never rushing, never forcing. He believed fear broke spirits faster than bones. With time, Brutus began to listen, to trust, to meet Thomas's gaze without flinching. Potential lived in that animal, bright and dangerous, waiting for guidance rather than domination. These horses were not possessions to Thomas. They were companions. They were the only souls on the estate who looked at him and saw something other than a price. They greeted him without demand, accepted his touch without suspicion, leaned into his presence as if it mattered. In a world that stripped him of name and choice, they gave him something dangerously close to dignity, and every day he watched that dignity violated. Edmund rode with cruelty disguised as entitlement. His spurs bit deep, sharp enough to draw blood, and when Thomas returned sovereign to the store, the stallion, sides trembled, foam flecked his mouth, and red lines stained his coat. Thomas cleaned the wounds in silence, pressing salve into torn skin, murmuring words meant more for himself than the animal. Apologies, regret, promises he could not keep. Charles was worse. His temper snapped without warning. When Tempest hesitated at a jump, uncertainty flashing through her body, he lashed out. Thomas saw the strike land, saw the mare rear back in shock, saw the mark bloom across her face like a bruise against the pale gray of her skin. The urge to step forward burned through Thomas's chest, but he remained still. He knew what interference cost. He knew how easily a life could be erased. Marcus inflicted harm through neglect. He rode until midnight shook beneath him, then abandoned the horse to cold and exhaustion. Thomas would find him later, standing alone, muscles locked, breath shallow. He spent hours undoing damage Marcus never noticed, warming the animal, easing pain, preventing sickness born of indifference. The ledger man never saw the cost of what he wrote off as efficiency. Daniel took pleasure in control. When Brutus pulled or shied, when youth showed itself through curiosity or strength, Daniel answered with violence. The crop came down again and again, not to teach, but to assert dominance. Thomas watched Brutus learn fear where trust should have grown. Each blow echoed somewhere deep inside him. Thomas did not speak. He could not. Silence was survival. He buried his anger beneath routine, buried grief beneath work. He tried not to remember Ruth. As face as fever took her. Tried not to feel the scars on his own back when his shirt clung to sweat. Tried not to imagine the rest of his life unfolding exactly as the past had, endless and unchanging. But the mind does not obey commands so easily. The summer pressed down like a curse. Heat turned the air thick, heavy enough to choke on. The fields sagged beneath the sun. Horses stood dull-eyed, conserving strength, enduring. News from the war carried rot with it, loss after loss. The slow tightening around Richmond. Hope withered faster than the tobacco leaves. Inside the house, the men grew restless. Thomas heard their voices through the old walls, louder now, sharper. He did not intend to listen, but sound crept through cracks and carried itself to him. Panic hid behind their anger. Numbers failed them. Ships did not come. Money dissolved into worthlessness. One night a name was spoken that made his hands go still against Sovereign's warm flank. They spoke of selling, liquidating, of cutting losses. And then casually they spoke of him. Thomas felt the world narrow. The brush paused mid-stroke. His breath caught as if the air itself had turned solid. They discussed his value as if he were another tool, another asset to be converted into coin. He was useful, they said, which meant he could be sold. Easily, profitably. In that moment, something inside Thomas shifted, not rage, not despair. Clarity. The horses sensed it. Sovereign leaned closer. Midnight shifted in his stall. Brutus stamped, unsettled. The stable seemed to hum with awareness, as if every beam and nail understood what had just been decided. Thomas had spent his life surviving by enduring, but endurance had limits. He knew now that the future they planned for him held only separation, sale, and the erasure of the one place where he still mattered. The horses would be torn from him. Scattered, broken in new ways, the thought hollowed him out. And into that hollow space, something else began to grow. He finished his work that night with steady hands. He spoke softly, he moved carefully. Nothing outward changed, but beneath the calm, beneath the practiced obedience, a plan began to breathe, not born of impulse, but of knowledge earned over years. He knew the animals. He knew the land. He knew fear and how it traveled. Outside, the estate slept uneasily. The men drank and argued, blind to the shift that had already occurred. The horses listened. Thomas listened, and the dark gathered itself, patient and precise, waiting for the moment when trust, instinct, and desperation would collide. The gate had not yet opened, but it would. Attachment, Thomas had learned, was treated as weakness. Caring too deeply made you vulnerable. Loving anything in that place meant handing someone else a weapon. Powerlessness had been his second lesson. Taught not with words, but with watching, again and again, as cruelty unfolded while he stood frozen, unable to intervene. Love in that world was a liability that could be exploited or erased at will. When the words reached him through the wall, they struck harder than any whip. They spoke of selling him as easily as they spoke of selling land or livestock, of converting his years into currency to fund their escape. 15 years of labor, 15 years of loyalty, reduced to a transaction. He felt it in his chest like a blow that knocked the air from his lungs. He was not a man to them. He was inventory. They debated his fate with lazy detachment. Who would manage the horses, someone asked. The answer came quickly, dismissively. They would hire another, someone white, someone trustworthy. That word echoed in Thomas's mind, hollow and cruel. Trust. After all this time, after devotion so complete it bordered on devotion to something holy, he was still considered unworthy of it. They weighed his price, argued timing, discussed markets and war as if his life were already over. Something inside him fractured. That night, sleep never came. Thomas sat in the narrow room above the stable, listening to the slow rhythm of hooves shifting. Below, the quiet breaths of animals who did not know they were also being condemned. His thoughts drifted without permission. Ruth's face returned, pale and distant. The scars across his back burned as if freshly opened. Every humiliation, every stolen moment, every reminder of his own erasure rose up together, pressing against him until his chest felt too tight to breathe. And then there were the horses. They trusted him without question. They responded to his voice, his touch, his presence. They would follow him anywhere. The realization settled slowly, terrifying in its clarity. An idea emerged, fully formed, not as fantasy but as possibility. It was horrifying, it was unforgivable, and it was so simple it felt inevitable. Could he do it? Could he end 4 lives? Not by chance, not by defense, but deliberately. The thought sickened him. He had been raised to believe that murder was the ultimate sin. He had sat in the estate chapel, listening to sermons about obedience and divine order, about suffering as virtue. He had been told that his chains were sacred, that his pain served a higher purpose. Somewhere along the way, that faith had collapsed under the weight of lived experience. A God who sanctioned this world was not a God worth fearing. Thomas spent days trapped inside the question of justice. What did morality mean when the law declared you an object? What did righteousness look like in a system built entirely on sanctioned cruelty? There were no courts for him, no appeals, no future where fairness waited patiently. There was only endurance or action. He thought of the others bound to the estate, living under constant threat. He imagined what would happen if he was sold, if another overseer took Daniel's place, someone worse, someone eager to prove himself. He imagined Edmund growing more violent as his control slipped away. He imagined the horses passed into rougher hands, beaten, misunderstood, worked until their spirits snapped. And he thought of himself, 35 years old, already exhausted beyond measure, facing the prospect of starting over somewhere unknown, under someone new, with fresh cruelties waiting to be learned. How many more times could he survive loss? How many more scars could his body carry before there was nothing left but pain? The answer came not as a declaration but as surrender to truth. There was no good path forward, only choices that carried different kinds of damnation. To remain passive was to accept a slow death of the soul. To act was to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. To understand what followed, one had to understand what 15 years of unrelenting cruelty had done to him. Trauma does not arrive all at once. It accumulates layer by layer until it becomes part of the body, something that settles into the bones and breath. Thomas carried those years inside him, each one pressing against the next. There was the punishment early on, delivered publicly for a failure that had not been his. He had warned them, he had been ignored. When the lash came down, it tore more than skin. It tore belief. He remembered lying face down for days, unable to rest on his back, tended by quiet hands that knew pain well. He remembered being told the wounds would heal, but the marks would remain. That lesson stayed with him. There was the day his friend was sold away for nothing more than a glance that offended pride. Thomas had been forced to assist, to become part of the violence by proximity. He watched a family fracture in real time, watched grief hollow people out until nothing remained. He saw what power could do when unchecked, how easily lives could be dismantled for convenience or spite. Those memories did not fade. They stacked upon one another, compressing his spirit until something had to give. By the time the decision settled fully into his mind, it did not feel like rage. It felt like inevitability, like the final movement of a long, cruel story that had been written long before he ever understood the language it used. Outside, the estate remained unaware. Lamps glowed, glasses clinked. Plans were made. Inside the stable, Thomas moved quietly among the horses, his touch steady, his voice low. They sensed the shift in him, the gravity of what approached. The night seemed to lean closer, listening. The gate was still closed, but not for long. Caring for another soul had always been forbidden, an unspoken law enforced by pain. To love was to offer the masters a sharper blade, a more intimate way to wound. Thomas had learned that early, learned it deeply, learned it in scars that never quite faded. And yet, the moment Ruth entered his life, those hard lessons dissolved as if they had never existed, washed away by something fragile and dangerous and impossibly human. She arrived at Riverside Estate, carried in the language of ownership, traded from a distant sale like an object with a price attached. Young, composed, and possessing an intelligence that revealed itself in quiet glances rather than bold words, she unsettled him from the first moment he saw her. She worked inside the main house where Thomas did not belong, but he found reasons to linger nearby, excuses to pass through shadows where he might glimpse her reflection in a window or hear her voice drift into the yard. Their conversations were brief and cautious, exchanged in stolen seconds where discovery meant punishment. She spoke of a life fractured, of family taken from her piece by piece, of dreams she refused, let die even when reality demanded it. He spoke of horses and the strange comfort he found among creatures who responded to kindness rather than fear. Slowly, almost without noticing, they built something dangerous between them. Love did not arrive as a declaration. It crept in quietly, growing stronger with every whispered exchange, every share. Silence in the narrow space between buildings where the darkness felt protective. They met there at night, holding hands as if touch itself were an act of defiance. They spoke of escape, of a north that existed more as an idea than a destination, knowing, even as they spoke, that such hopes were little more than breath carried away by the wind. Still, for a time, it was enough. For years, Ruth became the reason Thomas endured. She softened the cruelty of the days, made survival feel like something more than waiting to die. Then illness came, sudden and merciless. A cough that refused to leave, a fever that burned hotter with each passing night. Within days, she could no longer rise from her bed. Within weeks, her body began to fail entirely. Thomas begged for permission to sit with her, to hold her hand, to let her know she was not alone. The request was dismissed without thought. A ride had been planned. A horse needed saddling. The comfort of a dying woman held no weight against routine. Thomas prepared the horse with hands that trembled, assisted the master into the saddle, and watched him disappear down the road while the woman he loved struggled for breath somewhere behind him. She died without him, alone, calling his name into a room that offered no answer. He was not allowed to bury her. There was work to be done, animals to tend. The world did not pause for grief. That was the moment something inside him broke beyond repair, not with noise or drama, but with a quiet finality that left nothing standing. He understood then that nothing he loved, would ever be permitted to last. Loss was not inflicted out of cruelty alone, but from a deeper indifference that made suffering invisible. After her death, hope vanished entirely. What remained was endurance stripped of illusion. He lived because his body demanded it. He worked because stopping would mean punishment. The days blurred into one another, indistinguishable hollow. He moved through them like a man already buried, eyes open but soul absent. Cruelty continued as it always had, sometimes erupting without warning. He was forced to witness a boy beaten until his legs failed him, punishment delivered for a moment as delay. The boy survived, but something vital had been taken. His silence afterward mirrored Thomas' own reflection, a look that spoke of inner collapse. When war began, whispers of freedom rippled through the quarters, fragile and electric. For a brief moment, the future seemed uncertain in a way that felt promising. That hope did not survive long. As the conflict dragged on, fear tightened its grip on the estate. Rations shrank. Whippings increased. Control became obsession. People were worked harder, fed less, driven toward exhaustion, with no regard for survival. Thomas watched it all without reaction, having learned that feeling only reopened wounds. Until the night everything changed. He overheard voices drifting through walls, careless and confident, discussing his fate as if he were already gone. Plans were made to sell him, to convert years of loyalty into money for escape. The words struck with a force he had forgotten existed. He was not a man. He was a resource. And it was not only his future being decided, but the future of the horses he had protected. Animals who trusted him completely, who would suffer under hands that saw them only as tools. That realization shattered the numbness he had carefully constructed. Justice and revenge blurred together until they were indistinguishable. He entered a state of awareness so sharp it bordered on agony. Every sound felt louder. Every movement carried meaning. He was planning something unforgivable, and the knowledge of it pressed against his chest day and night. Yet beneath the terror was something else. For the first time in years, he felt alive, truly alive, not because of hope, but because of decision. Inside the stable, the horses sensed the shift in him. His touch remained gentle, his voice low, but the air itself felt altered, heavy with approaching consequence. The night seemed to listen, leaning closer as if drawn by the gravity of what was about to unfold. The gate was still closed, but not for long. At first, the disturbances seemed accidental, the kind of small disruptions no one questioned, a sudden clang of metal. A dropped bucket echoing too loudly in the stable, a sharp sound in the dark that made muscles tense and nostrils flare. Over time, these moments grew more deliberate, more calculated. The air inside the stable changed, thick with unease, as if the horses themselves sensed they were being guided toward something unnamed and dreadful. Thomas watched closely. He learned how fear traveled through a body, how it settled into bone and sinew. He learned how a harmless startle could become agitation, how agitation could turn into force. Brutus was the first to show it clearly. Young, powerful, restless. At first, the kicks were clumsy, almost playful. Then they grew stronger, more precise, more violent. When Thomas spoke the word, soft but firm, Brutus responded with explosive power, lashing out with both hind legs. The stallion believed it was a trick, a lesson, a way to please the one human he trusted. He did not understand the true purpose taking shape behind Thomas's calm eyes. The others did not require such focused instruction. They needed only to be nudged toward chaos, their nerves tuned like tight wires ready to snap. Thomas began to cultivate tension in the stable. Subtly and patiently, he introduced uncertainty where there had been routine, unpredictability where there had been calm. The horses grew alert, watchful, restless. They shifted more in their stalls. They slept less deeply. Fear, once planted, does not require constant tending. The plan revealed itself to him slowly, not as a sudden inspiration, but as an unfolding truth. It was horrifying in its clarity, simple, efficient, and irreversible. It demanded only what he already possessed, his mastery of the horses, his unrestricted access to them, and the willingness to step beyond a boundary no one ever returned from. He knew each animal intimately, not as property, but as living forces with instincts shaped by fear and loyalty. He knew Sovereign's pride and possessiveness, how the stallion guarded his space with ferocity disguised beneath elegance. He knew Tempest's fragile nerves, how panic overtook her completely once it ignited, how she could not stop herself from running until her body failed. He knew Midnight's nature as a shadow, a follower who drew comfort from imitation rather than choice. And Brutus, still young, still volatile, carried violence like a spark waiting for air. But there was something else Thomas understood, something earned through years of silent observation. Horses could learn signals, sounds, gestures, words spoken with intention. They could be taught to associate safety with one cue, danger with another, and under the right conditions they could kill, not out of malice but instinct. Thomas had seen it before. He had watched men crushed beneath hooves, bodies broken because an animal felt cornered or threatened. Those deaths were accidents of fear. What haunted him was the question of direction. What if fear could be aimed? The risk was absolute. Discovery would mean death without hesitation. So Thomas remained unchanged on the surface. He fed the horses, cleaned the stalls, spoke when spoken to. He was invisible as he had always been. But when night fell and the estate slept, he worked quietly, methodically. He reshaped trust into something sharper, something dangerous. With Sovereign, it began as routine, a specific whistle used only during feeding. The sound came to mean comfort, territory, control. Over and over, whistle and grain, until the association rooted itself deep in the stallion's mind. Then Thomas introduced intrusion. A crude human shape made of cloth and hay, placed carefully inside the stall. Sovereign sniffed it, uncertain. The whistle came again. More grain, approval, safety. Gradually the shape began to move, just slightly at first. Sovereign startled, ears flattening, muscles tightening. Thomas praised him softly. The movements grew bolder, the intrusion more aggressive. Each time Sovereign reacted with force, he was rewarded. Protect your space. Protect what is yours. By the end of the week, the stallion attacked on instinct, striking, biting, crushing the false body beneath him. Tempest required a different hand. Fear already lived inside her. Thomas only needed to give it a name. A gesture became her signal, a deliberate motion of the hand that preceded chaos. Each time he made it, a loud sound followed. She panicked. He calmed her, but never fully. He left her trembling, heart racing, breath shallow. The gesture became danger itself, etched into her reflexes. Midnight learned by watching. He was exercised alongside Sovereign, absorbing the stallion, S aggression without resistance. Each time he followed Sovereign's lead, he was rewarded. Soon, he no longer hesitated. He mirrored instinctively, surrendering his will to the stronger presence. Brutus was shaped by language. A single word spoken with intent, a tap, a kick, praise, reward, again and again. The command embedded itself in his body, bypassing thought entirely. When Thomas spoke it, Brutus struck. Night after night, the stable transformed into something else, a place of preparation, of anticipation. The horses shifted in their stalls, sensing purpose, sensing the tension radiating from the man they trusted completely. Thomas felt it too. The weight of what he was creating pressed down on him constantly. But beneath the dread was something colder, focus, clarity. He was no longer drifting through days half dead. He was awake. Every sound mattered. Every movement carried consequence. The line he was approaching glowed in his mind, bright and terrifying. The stable breathed around him. Wood creaked. Hooves scraped softly against earth. Outside, the estate slept, unaware that its fate was already learning commands in the dark. The gate remained closed, but the horses were ready. The horses moved restlessly in their stalls, their muscles coiled, eyes bright in the dim light. Thomas worked quietly, deliberately, keeping them slightly tense, just on the edge of alert. Not enough to be obvious, not enough to draw suspicion, but enough that the moment the signal came, instinct would take over. It was a delicate balance, exhausting in every sense. He had to maintain his normal duties, feeding, grooming, cleaning, while also conducting the secret, dark training that had been building for months. Every sound, every shadow could betray him. One slip, one careless movement, and everything could unravel in an instant. But patience was nothing new. 15 years had honed it into a weapon. A few more days, a few more hours he could endure. He had to. On the 10th of September, the words hit him like a physical blow. Marcus Whitfield, careless in conversation, revealed to Edmund Harrington that a buyer had been secured. A plantation owner from South Carolina was willing to pay $800. Thomas had 10 days to act, to prepare, to align every detail of his dark plan. The horses were ready. The training was complete. Now, all that remained was the right moment. The perfect alignment of circumstance, the point at which all 4 men would be together, unsuspecting and vulnerable. The Wednesday meetings were predictable, ritualized, and therefore ideal. Every week, the men gathered in the study, drinking, talking, planning. The meetings stretched late into the night, their voices carrying through the old walls. But Thomas needed them outside in the paddock where the horses waited, where the shadows would work for him. He needed a reason, a plausible pretext that wouldn't draw suspicion, that wouldn't hint at the inevitability of what was to come. Days of thought passed in silence, a dark calculus turning over in his mind. How to draw them all into the paddock at the same hour. How to motivate them to venture outside when dusk was falling, when the light was fading, when every shadow seemed heavier, more menacing. The answer came unexpectedly. On the 12th, Edmund Harrington announced that a potential buyer would visit the estate on Wednesday the 14th. A wealthy merchant from North Carolina interested in purchasing several horses. Edmund wanted to showcase his stock in the paddock. Thomas's pulse quickened as he listened from the shadows hidden in the hallway. We'll bring them all out. Let him see them move, see their temperaments. Garrett will have them ready by 8. The words were simple, ordinary, casual, but to Thomas they were everything. The opportunity had arrived, but there was a complication. The buyer would be present, a man entirely innocent of any grievance, a witness to the unfolding plan. He would have to be delayed, separated, removed without suspicion. 2 days became a blur of planning. The roads leading to Riverside Estate were familiar, traveled countless times in service of the masters. Thomas knew the hidden weaknesses, the worn planks of a bridge 3 miles from the estate, the weakened timber left exposed by the storm last month. A minor sabotage there, executed in the dark, would force the buyer to take a longer route, to arrive too late to see what Thomas had prepared. It was dangerous, undeniably so. Discovery would mean immediate execution. But he had already crossed lines that made fear irrelevant. The path forward was absolute. That night, after midnight, Thomas moved. He took the saw from the stable, wrapping it carefully to muffle its sound. The world was black around him, moonlight painting faint streaks across the ground. He approached the bridge silently, assessing the damage already inflicted by wind and rain. It was old, worn, weakened, the perfect instrument of delay. He cut carefully, methodically. 3 critical support beams sliced halfway through, precise enough to hold a single horse. A lone man, but not the weight of 4 horses and a carriage. The work took hours. Each cut measured, each sound of the saw muffled, every shadow observed for signs of detection. When he finished, the bridge appeared intact, deceptively so, a mask of normalcy. A carriage crossing it would collapse into the creek below, a harmless fall of 3 feet. A sudden shock that would remove the buyer from the equation without injury. Thomas lingered a moment, hand on the cool timber, and a flicker of guilt crossed him. But he forced it down. No one mattered more than the plan now. The bridge, the horses, the moment, the convergence of all elements was all that existed. As he returned to the estate, his thoughts turned to the paddock, to the horses waiting like silent accomplices. Sovereign, Tempest, Midnight, Brutus they had learned, adapted, and now stood on the threshold of action. Thomas, his hands had shaped instinct, his voice had directed fear, his mind had guided violence without the world ever suspecting. The estate slept, unaware that its fate was already in motion. Wood creaked in the stable. Hooves shifted against the earth. Shadows clung to the corners, waiting. The gate remained closed, but not for long. The night had not yet ended, But Thomas moved through the stable as though it already belonged to him, as though the darkness itself leaned in to listen. Each horse responded to his presence, muscles coiling, ears flicking, eyes bright and sharp in the dim light. He had spent months, years even, building this fragile web of trust and instinct, and now it trembled on the edge of its final test. Outside, the estate lay quiet, the morning approaching with its false promise of safety. But Thomas did not sleep. Sleep had abandoned him, as it always did when the weight of inevitability pressed down. He thought about the 4 men who would die tonight, 4 men who had spent their lives spreading cruelty, who had built their fortune on fear, who had measured the value of others in suffering and dollars. And yet, even knowing they had earned the fate waiting for them, Thomas felt the crushing gravity of what he was about to do. He had never wanted to be a killer. The thought of it sickened him, but choice had been stripped from him, row by row, scar by scar. Accept his sale, accept new masters, accept years of slow torment, or take control, even if it meant becoming the monster his world insisted he could not escape. The moral weight pressed down as a physical thing, tight in his chest, settling in his limbs, and yet clarity had never felt so sharp. The plan was complete. The horses were ready. He had sharpened instinct and patience into a weapon. He had studied every tendon, every fear, every reflex. Sovereign, magnificent and territorial, tempest, nervous and panicked, a storm barely restrained, midnight, obedient and impressionable, Brutus, young, fiery, untamed. Each one had learned a language, subtle and precise, signals whispered in the quiet hours. Gestures folded into routine until they were as natural as breathing. They would obey, they would follow, and tonight they would become instruments of reckoning. The morning sun rose in oblivious brilliance, washing the estate in gold. The sky was unmarred by clouds, serene, beautiful, the kind of day that promised peace to anyone who did not know what darkness was already stirring beneath it. Thomas moved as usual, feeding the horses, checking water, brushing coats until they gleamed like polished obsidian. He lingered with each one, whispering, apologizing, acknowledging the weight he was about to place upon them. "I'm sorry," he said to Sovereign, hand sliding along the stallion's powerful neck. "I'm sorry for what I ask of you, but after tonight, you will never be hurt again." Sovereign nuzzled his shoulder, an act of pure trust, and Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. Hours crept forward. The estate operated as though nothing were amiss. Thomas repaired broken bridles, cleaned the tack, straightened the stable. Each action was mechanical, normal, necessary. Yet in his mind, the entire sequence played like a rehearsal for chaos. He envisioned every step, every panic, every precise timing. When Edmund Harrington arrived in the afternoon, his presence sent a spike of adrenaline through Thomas, but had concealed it with practiced calm. "All 17 horses are in prime condition," he said, eyes lowered, voice neutral. Edmund scrutinized him, but Thomas held his stillness, letting the heat of anticipation coil inside like fire. The clock crawled. Each creak of the house, each distant footstep, amplified the rhythm in Thomas's chest. At 5 o'clock, he began preparing the 4 pivotal horses, brushing, checking hooves, adjusting every detail. Their coats shone, their eyes glimmered with latent power, their bodies taut with expectation. These horses were magnificent. These horses were dangerous. And Thomas was their conductor, every signal and whisper a note in a symphony of vengeance. Then came the interruption. Voices carried from the main house, sharp and urgent. Thomas stepped from the shadows, keeping low, ears straining. A young messenger, hair matted and hoarse, sweating, was speaking quickly to Edmund. His bridge had collapsed. The carriage had gone through but was damaged. The buyer could not arrive tonight. He would come later, delayed by days, forced to take an alternate route. Relief and frustration coiled together in Thomas's chest. The plan would proceed. The men would be in the paddock at the appointed time, unobserved, unsuspecting. The buyer, the innocent man, would not witness what was to come. The estate remained oblivious, the sun climbing higher, casting long golden fingers across the paddock. Shadows leaned at impossible angles, watching, waiting. The horses shifted, soft hooves against dirt, nostrils flaring, sensing the tension, the inevitability. Thomas exhaled slowly, his mind a taut wire of anticipation and resolve. By nightfall nothing would be the same. The gate would open. Darkness would descend, precise and unyielding, and the horses, his silent, powerful collaborators, would enact what instinct, training, and rage had been shaped to perform. Wood groaned under their weight. Hooves scraped softly. The wind carried a whisper through the paddock as though the land itself were listening. The estate was alive with ordinary sounds, unaware that its fate was rehearsing in the shadows. The final act was waiting, inevitable, imminent. The horses, the instruments of justice, had been ready for weeks. Thomas had been ready for a lifetime. The sun, as warmth did nothing to dull the tension, and the air felt thick, heavy with promise and dread. Every step, every breath, every heartbeat carried the weight of what was about to unfold. The gate remained closed, but not for long. The afternoon light waned, casting long, trembling shadows across the paddock, and Thomas felt a surge of tension coiling tight in his chest. Relief mixed with terror as he realized the buyer was delayed. Safe, innocent, but that left the four men, Edmund, Charles, Marcus, and Daniel, angry, impatient, restless. Would they still come? Would they still insist on seeing the horses, or would they cancel, dismissing the evening as wasted time? Voices carried from the house. Edmund scowled, jaw tight. "Damn it," he muttered, pacing. "I was counting on that sale." Charles limped into the yard, drink in hand, squinting toward the collapsed bridge. "What's happening?" he asked. "The buyer can't make it. Bridge collapsed. That old bridge on the main road." He shook his head. "County's been promising to fix that for months. Typical incompetence." Marcus emerged behind him, followed by Daniel. The four men gathered in a tight cluster, gesturing, arguing, oblivious to the figure lurking in the shadows. Thomas, as heart thundered, each beat a drum of inevitability. "I wanted to see those horses run," Charles said, voice tinged with frustration. "Been looking forward to it all week." Marcus waved a hand dismissively. "We don't need a buyer to appreciate good horse flesh. Let Garrett bring them out. Evening light will do." Daniel nodded, rubbing his chin. "Agreed. I want to see how Brutus performs. Been working with him all month." Thomas felt the world narrow, time compressing to a single point. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for, dreading, dreaming, plotting. Edmund hesitated, lips pressed thin, then shrugged. "Why not, Garrett? Bring all the horses to the paddock. Private demonstration." "Yes, sir," Thomas said, voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. Hands shaking slightly, he returned to the stable. Every step toward the horses felt like moving through a dense fog of anticipation and fear. This was really happening. In mere minutes, everything would change. No going back. He paused in the center of the stable, surrounded by the animals he had nurtured, trained, loved. He thought of Ruth, of the life they could never have, of the slaves who had suffered and died at Riverside, of 15 years trapped under cruelty, of 10 days before his own sale, and above all he thought of justice or revenge or whatever name it deserved. One by one he led the horses out, sovereign first, the stallion's coat gleaming in the fading light, pride in every step. Tempest followed, gray and restless, sensing the tension radiating from Thomas. Midnight, calm and obedient, moved silently behind, a shadow of the stallion. Brutus, young and fiery, pranced impatiently, eager to show what he had learned. The remaining 13 horses followed, a mixture of breeds and temperaments, all poised, all ready. The four men leaned on the fence, whiskey on their breaths, voices loud and careless. They were relaxed, entertained, convinced of their invincibility. This was amusement, a display of their wealth and power, nothing more. Thomas's fury hardened, cold and absolute. They had no idea. They believed themselves untouchable. They were wrong. The paddock stretched wide and open, fenced in. A stage for the horses, training for demonstration, for tonight's reckoning. Thomas led the last animal in, shutting the gate behind him. The horses milled, calm and trusting. They had known this ground for years. They had never feared it. Tonight, the rules had changed. Beautiful animals, Marcus said, leaning casually on the fence, eyes bright with appreciation. Finest stock in Virginia, Edmund added, almost reluctantly. Garrett's done well. They spoke as if Thomas weren't there, as if he were part of the scenery, as if his presence meant nothing. He walked to the center of the paddock, the 4 key horses forming a protective circle around him, hands sliding over Sovereign's powerful neck. He felt the warmth, the living strength beneath his fingers. "I'm sorry," he whispered, quiet, intimate, unheard by the men. "Forgive me." Edmund's voice cut through the air, distant and careless. "Show us Sovereign's paces. Let's see him run." Thomas's pulse pounded in his ears. This was it, the moment of no return. Once the first signal went, there would be no stopping. He thought of Ruth one last time, of the lives destroyed by these 4 men, of 15 years of chains, bruises, and endless servitude. Then he raised his hand, a subtle gesture he had taught Tempest, a signal, simple yet heavy with consequence. Panic. Run. Tempest's eyes widened, ears pinned, a scream of terror echoing across the paddock. She reared, muscles coiling with controlled chaos, and then she bolted, not away, but directly toward the fence where the men stood. Charles started to shout, but his voice caught. He stumbled on his bad leg as Tempest thundered forward. Hooves struck wood, splintering the fence with explosive force. The sound cracked through the evening like thunder. Charles tried to leap back, faltering. Brutus, eager, energetic, followed suit, hooves hammering the ground, a deadly rhythm. The horses were a blur of movement, fear, and trained instinct converging on the men who had never imagined such betrayal from the creatures they had considered mere property. The moment had arrived, the culmination of years of planning, training, and quiet rage. Riverside Estate, so long a place of cruelty and routine, had transformed into a stage for reckoning. And Thomas, standing at the center, felt the final surge of control, of destiny, of horror and release intertwined. The air vibrated with the sound of hooves splintering wood and the panic he had orchestrated. The sun dipped low, casting the paddock in molten shadows. The gate had opened, the hour had come, and there was no turning back. The estate was silent no more. The sound of justice, terrible and unstoppable, had arrived. The paddock was a storm of motion, the air thick with dust and the acrid tang of fear. Thomas watched from the center, his body tense yet eerily calm. Charles went down first, a wet, gasping sound escaping his throat as his legs betrayed him and refused to carry him. Edmund barked orders, voice sharp, face red with rage. "Garrett, control that horse." But Thomas wasn't trying to control everything. He was merely beginning. He raised his hand and whistled, the sharp, exact note he had taught Sovereign. The sound carried a command older than reason, older than instinct, a command that meant attack, destroy, annihilate. The bay stallion, as body shifted, every muscle coiling with lethal energy, ears flattened, nostrils flaring, eyes rolling white. A scream tore from him. A guttural roar of aggression that Thomas had never heard, a sound that chilled the marrow. Sovereign surged forward, hooves pounding the earth, eyes locked on the men by the fence. Edmund tried to flee, but the stallion was faster. Sovereign reared high, the first hoof striking Edmund squarely in the shoulder, spinning him, the second slamming down upon his head. A sickening crack echoed across the paddock, and Edmund dropped like a rag doll, limp and broken. Marcus Whitfield tried to scramble over the fence. Desperation painted across his face. His shaking hands could barely hold the top rail. Midnight, trained to mirror Sovereign as fury smashed into the fence from the opposite side, hooves crashing into the wood where Marcus clung. He fell backward, chest hitting the dirt, scrambling, only to be met by Midnight. As relentless charge, hooves rained down again and again, the sound wet, thudding final. Daniel Cross, cold and calculating, drew a pistol from his belt, aiming for Sovereign, finger tightening. The shot rang out but missed, burying itself uselessly in the dirt. Brutus, young, fiery, perfectly trained, spun on cue. Thomas had shouted the word he had drilled into him, strike, and the chestnut stallion, as hind legs lashed out, connecting with Daniel's midsection in a blow that sent him sprawling 10 feet away. He tried to rise, but pain and shock pinned him to the earth. Then all 17 horses erupted at once, a frenzy of fury and terror. The other 13, primed for chaos, bolted, hooves pounding the dirt, manes flying, eyes rolling in a white frenzy. Dust turned, air shook, and the paddock became a living nightmare. And yet Thomas, standing dead center, untouched, calm as a still point in the heart of a hurricane, moved with the quiet authority of someone who had earned trust over 15 long years. They would not harm him. The men had no such protection. Charles crawled, dragging himself toward the gate with useless limbs, chest caved in, tempest circled, still panicked, hooves striking him repeatedly until his movement ceased entirely. Edmund, blood pooling around his head, lifted his gaze toward Thomas, a mixture of shock, pain, and the fleeting spark of recognition in his eyes. "You," he gasped, unable to finish. Sovereign descended on him again, the weight and power of the stallion striking with relentless precision. Each impact was a drumbeat of terror that would haunt Thomas forever. Marcus staggered to his feet, one arm useless, blood streaming from his mouth, pleading, crying, begging. But there was no mercy, no reprieve tonight. Midnight and 3 others converged upon him, a coordinated assault of hooves, fury, and instinct, until his cries were cut off, leaving nothing but silence. Daniel Cross, last to rise, hand pressed against his wound, looked at Thomas with a glare of hatred that could freeze the soul. "Dead, you'll be," he rasped. Brutus struck again before he could finish. The young stallion's shoulder collided with Daniel, knocking him flat. Then the precise, deadly training Thomas had instilled took over. Brutus' hind legs came down repeatedly, perfect, devastating, until even resistance was impossible. The chaos finally ceased. Thomas whistled again, the calm, all-clear signal. The horses slowed, heaving, eyes wild, but no longer attacking. Their trust, hard-earned and absolute, had preserved him even in the midst of fury. Around him, the paddock was silent except for the soft snorts and breathing of the horses. The rustle of the evening whined through the tobacco plants, and his own pounding heartbeat. Thomas moved among the fallen, checking each one. Edmund Harrington's skull was shattered, face unrecognizable. Charles Harrington's back twisted grotesquely, broken beyond repair. Marcus Whitfield's chest caved in, ribs shattered, body unmoving. Daniel Cross's neck bent at an impossible angle, lifeless. All 4 were gone, taken by the very creatures they had considered property, the animals they had abused, the beings they had underestimated. And Thomas, surrounded by 17 horses, each a living instrument of his will, felt a dark, hollow triumph. The paddock lay in ruins, splintered wood and churned earth, but for the first time in 15 years, the chains of Riverside Estate could not touch him. The estate itself seemed to shiver in the aftermath, aware, perhaps, that something primal, something inevitable, had been unleashed. Silence settled over the land like a suffocating shroud. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting molten shallows that stretched long and black across the paddock. No cries, no commands, no whimpers from men, only the heavy breathing of the horses, the crackling remnant of chaos frozen in place, and the quiet, steady presence of Thomas, the architect of it all. Tonight, Riverside Estate had learned that cruelty can breed its own reckoning. The animals, the witnesses of years of suffering, had been his instruments, guided by patience, by knowledge, by the raw necessity of survival and vengeance. And as the darkness deepened, Thomas understood the unshakable truth: justice, when wrought by those who had known despair, could be as terrifying and absolute as death itself. The wind whispered through the paddock, the final echoes of terror fading into night, and for Thomas, for the horses, and for the estate itself, Nothing would ever be the same again. The paddock was silent now, yet the silence felt alive, vibrating with the memory of hooves, screams, and splintering wood. Thomas stood in the center, blood on his hands, on his clothes, the world narrowed to nothing but the strange, suffocating calm that follows chaos. He felt nothing, no triumph, no relief, no remorse, only a vast, hollow numbness, as if the act itself had drained every ounce of humanity from him. He had done it, he had actually done it. And now he had to vanish from the house, the quarters, the fields. The estate stirred. People came running, drawn by the shouts, the gunshot, the cacophony of destruction. Faces appeared in the fading light, pale with horror, eyes wide with disbelief. 4 men lay dead in the paddock, broken and silent, and 17 horses milled calmly, their breaths rising in soft clouds in the cool evening air, eyes alert but placid, as if nothing had happened. And in the center of it all, Thomas Garrett, stable master, stood untouched, impossible, still, blood on his hands and clothes, an image of unnatural calm amid the storm. What happened? Someone shouted, "What did you do?" The question stung, but Thomas didn't answer. He moved through the crowd, past the pointing fingers, past the murmurs of fear and disbelief, and he walked toward the stable. Each step carried urgency, but he kept his gait measured, controlled. He had maybe an hour, maybe less, before anyone could figure out how to stop him. He climbed the narrow stairs to his small room above the stable and collected what little he owned. A spare shirt, a blanket, a small knife, nothing more. Everything else he had belonged to the estate, to the men he had destroyed, or to the horses who had just been forced to betray instinct. Outside, the noise escalated, shouts for the sheriff, for a doctor, for someone to explain the inexplicable. Thomas knew that nothing they could say would make sense, not in a way they could understand. He descended, slipping through the stable one last time. Horses that had not been in the paddock lifted their heads, soft nickerings drifting through the dusk. He paused at each stall, running a hand along their sleek necks, whispering apologies. "I am sorry," he breathed, the words nearly lost in the ambient noise. "I am sorry I made you do something against your nature. I had no choice. You understand that, don't you?" They pressed their noses against him, warm, trusting, unknowing of the exact role they had played. And for the first time in years, Thomas allowed himself the briefest taste of grief. He left through the back door of the stable, stepping into the fields under a sky completely swallowed by darkness. The night was a cloak, perfect for disappearing, perfect for leaving everything behind. The tobacco field stretched ahead, shadowed and silent. He didn't look back. Behind him, Riverside Estate burned with light, confusion and chaos. Ahead, there was nothing but the blackness of freedom, uncertain and dangerous, yet entirely his own. For the first time in 15 years, Thomas Garrett was free. The aftermath would be rewritten in words the world could accept. The official investigation concluded it was a tragic accident. Horses, spooked by some imagined threat, a snake, a loud noise had panicked, and 4 men had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Catastrophic, but ultimately explainable. The precision, the coordination, the way each horse had targeted specific individuals and ignored every other person went unremarked. Perhaps the coroner noticed, perhaps he did, perhaps he chose silence, because to acknowledge the truth would be to accept a horror too large to contemplate, that a slave had orchestrated the deaths of 4 white men using animals as instruments of vengeance. In 1864 Virginia, amid the chaos of war, there was no room for such a truth. So they called it an accident. They moved on. Thomas Garrett's disappearance became a footnote, shrugged off as one more runaway. In a time when the Confederacy's collapse made such things ordinary, the sheriff made a token attempt to pursue him, but with the armies advancing, the land in turmoil, and the social order unraveling, there were larger concerns than a single man. No one wanted to look too closely at what had happened. It was easier not to see, easier to pretend that justice had not arrived in a form so terrible, so absolute, so personal. The horses, too, were dispersed. Within a month, they were sold. Sovereign to a North Carolina plantation, a magnificent stallion bought by a man who only knew of the tragedy. Tempest went to a cavalry officer, her past irrelevant, her spirit unbroken. Midnight and Brutus were lost to the winds of time. scattered across the Carolinas and Virginia. Some served in the war, pressed into armies desperate for mounts. None ever attacked another human being. Their moment of violent precision remained a secret, hidden in plain sight, locked within the instincts of creatures trained by patience, by necessity, by a quiet fury. The estate itself would change hands. Seized by Union forces after Richmond fell, the Harrington family losing all. Their children scattered, their property destroyed, their legacies extinguished. Catherine Whitfield returned to Richmond, living on charity. The little house of Daniel Cross burned, unwept. Riverside Estate, once a place of cruelty and fear, became a for-profit under Northern management, paid labor replacing chains. But Thomas Garrett was gone. He was no longer a man shaped by bondage, by cruelty, by oppression. He was a shadow in the night, a whisper in the fields, a ghost whose vengeance had been delivered and whose freedom had been claimed. And the world accepted the story it wanted to hear. The truth, however, remained that sometimes justice is not neat, not lawful, not recognized. Sometimes it comes like a storm of hooves and fury, silent to those who cannot see, unstoppable to those who dare to face it. The wind still whispers through the fields where Riverside once stood. The echoes of hooves of terror, of the last act of a man pushed beyond endurance, remain in the soil, in the night, in the memory of the land itself. And for those who know where to listen, the story is still there, waiting to be told on Gospel of the Haunted, a story of darkness, of freedom, and of vengeance executed with terrifying precision. The land changed hands again and again, the estate passing through decades of new ownership, each trying to make sense or profit of a place steeped in shadows. The main house still stands, a museum now, polished and curated, though the story of that night in '84 is whispered around corners, carefully omitted from tour scripts. It's the kind of tale that does attract crowds, that does sit comfortably in history books. But the question still lingers, what truly happened on that September evening? That question haunted anyone who'd seen the aftermath, anyone who had been near the estate, anyone who had felt the weight of the events even from a distance. Some claimed it was divine justice, that some higher power had reached through the ordinary world to punish four cruel men with the very animals they had treated as property, as tools, as objects beneath them. Reverend Patterson, standing at the pulpit the following Sunday, delivered a sermon about the wages of sin. He never named Riverside Estate, never spoke of Thomas Garrett, but the congregation knew exactly what he meant. Others dismissed it as misfortune, the cruel hand of coincidence. Horses were unpredictable, after all. Sometimes panic had tragic consequences, and accidents happened. No one was to blame. So the story went. A few murmured suspicions about Thomas, though no one could ever articulate exactly how a single man might have orchestrated 17 horses to single out 4 specific victims. It sounded impossible, unbelievable, absurd. Yet the slaves on Riverside Estate knew, or at least suspected. They had seen Thomas in the shadows, walking with calm certainty toward an impossible plan. They had watched him disappear into the night, leaving behind blood and silence and a justice they could only dream of. When questioned by the sheriff, they claimed ignorance. They had found the men dead. Thomas had been there, and then he had vanished. That was all. A lie? Certainly. But it was a lie they all agreed to tell, a lie born of survival, reverence, and fear, because Thomas had done what none of them could. He had struck back. He had claimed vengeance that others dared only to imagine. Thomas Garrett was never seen again. Rumors drifted, like shadows in fog. Some said he had been glimpsed in Philadelphia, working under a new name at a quiet stable. Others whispered he had made it to Canada, living among escaped slaves who had welcomed him into their fold. A third version told of him dying on the way to Union lines, buried in an unmarked grave in Maryland, but no one knew for certain. He carried his secrets with him, and they vanished with him into the darkness. What remained was undeniable. 4 men died screaming in a paddock in Virginia on that September night in 884. 4 men who had built their lives on the suffering of others, 4 men who had believed that wealth, status, and cruelty placed them beyond consequence. And yet they fell, not to men, not to bullets or blades, but to the very animals they had raised, trained, and abused. Horses, creatures they had dismissed, ignored, considered property, considered expendable, and yet they became instruments of an unimaginable justice. There is a poetry in that, a terrible symmetry that chills the bone. But was it justice? Or was it murder? The line is thin, almost invisible, and it is precisely that ambiguity that makes the story linger, that keeps it alive in the dark corners of history. Thomas Garrett had no legal recourse. He had been property, denied rights, denied dignity, denied humanity. The men he served had absolute power, wielded with brutality and caprice. He had spent 15 years in bondage, beaten, humiliated, forced to witness suffering he could not stop. He had loved and lost. He had feared for his life. He had been told he would be sold, sent to new masters, subjected to new cruelties, and there would be no escape. And so he took control of what little he could. His weapons were skill, knowledge, patience, and the unerring trust of creatures who had never betrayed him. From the safety of the 21st century, it is easy to judge, to declare right from wrong, justice from vengeance. But place yourself in the stable that night, feel the weight of 15 years pressing down, listen to the laughter of men discussing your life as if it were a commodity, and ask yourself, what would you have done? Would you have accepted your fate? Or would you have found a way to reclaim your life, even if it meant stepping into a darkness you had never imagined? The descendants of the 4 men still live nearby. They do not speak of that night. Some will say they never discuss it because it is unpleasant. Others will insist that some stories are better left buried. Some truths they imply are too dangerous, too uncomfortable to revisit. And in that silence, the legend endures. Thomas Garrett remains a phantom, a whisper of retribution that moved through shells and fields and hearts alike. The horses, they survived, scattered to the winds, sold to new owners, pressed in service by armies, and used by those who knew nothing of their past. Sovereign, Tempest, Midnight, Brutus, and the others all had played their part and then were dispersed. None ever attacked again. None ever revealed the precision of that terrible evening. Their actions remained locked in memory and instinct, a secret understood only by the one who had commanded it. And so the estate changed, the Harrington family fell, and history moved on. But for those who listen, truly listen, the story remains, whispering through the fields, echoing through empty stables, carried on the wind. It is a story of darkness, of patience, of revenge wrought with terrifying precision. It is a story of freedom claimed in the most absolute, terrifying way possible. And it waits still, ready to be told on Gospel of the Haunted, where the shadows of history meet. The imagination and the line between justice and horror blurs into something unforgettable. Not to glorify violence, not to excuse murder, but to peer into the darkness of human endurance. To see what happens when someone is pushed beyond every conceivable limit. Thomas Garrett was pushed there, beyond reason, beyond fear. And when he finally snapped, when he finally struck back, he did so with a precision and intellect that chills the mind. There was no blind fury in his actions, no frenzied rage. Every move, every command, every signal had been studied, rehearsed, perfected. That is what makes this story so haunting. It was not a crime of passion. It was deliberate. It was intentional. For weeks, Thomas had trained the horses. Every creature on the estate, from the proud stallions to the nervous mare, had been conditioned, guided, transformed into instruments of his plan. He had anticipated every obstacle, manipulated circumstances, and even sabotage a bridge to ensure an innocent observer would not witness what he intended. He waited, patient, silent, and when the moment arrived, he struck. And when it was done, he walked away. No hesitation, no lingering regret. Just a man who had done what he felt necessary and then vanished into the night, leaving chaos behind him. What became of Thomas Garrett afterward? Did he sleep soundly, knowing he had accomplished what so few enslaved people could ever imagine? Or did the weight of his actions haunt him, creeping into dreams, into the silent moments between heartbeats? The truth, perhaps, will never be known, and maybe that is how it should be. Some mysteries are meant to remain in shadow, their answer unnecessary, their power intact in the questions themselves. The story of Thomas Garrett and the 4 men who died at Riverside Estate is not just a tale of revenge. It is a story of power and helplessness, a testament to the corrosive nature of absolute control. These men had spent years enforcing their dominion, inflicting suffering, stripping humanity from those they enslaved, treating people and animals alike as tools, as property, and in the end, that very cruelty became their undoing. Those same animals, the creatures they had ignored, abused, underestimated, turned on them. They became instruments of judgment, a reflection of the imbalance, reckoning no human hand could have delivered with such inevitability. There is a lesson there, raw and undeniable, a reminder that cruelty carries consequences, that power without compassion, without restraint, sows the seeds of its own destruction. The men of Riverside Estate believed themselves untouchable, shielded by wealth, status, and arrogance. They were wrong. Thomas Garrett dismantled their illusion, teaching them the harshest lesson of all, one that demanded the ultimate price, their lives. And so we are left with questions that will never have perfect answers. Was Thomas Garrett a hero or a murderer? Did those men deserve their fate? And what became of him after he disappeared into the darkness, leaving the estate behind, the echoes of terror still lingering in the air? If this story resonates with you, if it unsettles, challenges, or fascinates as it did me, then reflect on it. Consider the choices made, the limits tested, and the consequences borne, and perhaps subscribe to Gospel of the Haunted, where stories like this survive, stories that do not offer easy answers, that linger in shadow long after the final word, stories that reveal the terrifying, unforgettable truth of what humans are capable of when driven to the edge. The tale of Thomas Garrett, of revenge, justice, and freedom, is a story that refuses to end. It stays with you, echoing in the mind, haunting the quiet hours, reminding us that the line between justice and horror is thinner than we dare to imagine.